Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our event of the Science and Technology Behind Healthy Aging. I'm Jasmine Chiu, Assistant Director from Venture Building Team of SGInnovate. I'm very excited to kick off today's event. Before we start, I would like to give you a brief introduction of SGInnovate and Venture Building Team, in case you are new to our energetic and engaging community. SGInnovate was founded in 2016. It was set up to help entrepreneurial scientists to build globally relevant ventures. In SGInnovate, we believe Singapore have all the resources it needs to build commercially viable deep tech products. We also believe in using deep tech to solve meaningful and difficult problems for the world. Especially at Venture Building Team, we recognize that there is a large gap between lab to product and then to commercial use and scalability. Many entrepreneurial scientists who work on deep tech research often lack the experience to successfully translate this research. They deserve the best and the most appropriate help in such endeavors. The Venture Building Team seeks to be value to some of these innovators, employing our experience and networks to maximize the chance of success to translate deep tech research project to investor-ready startups. Our event often strives to bring like-minded people together to share their insightful perspective on important topic. Today, the topic will be discussed is close to my heart, as I have been working with today's speaker, Professor Kennedy, for a technology in the healthy aging area for almost a year. Prof. Kennedy is Distinguished Professor of Biochemistry and Physiology from NUS and Director, National University Health System Center of Healthy Aging, Singapore. Just like all of you, I look forward to the opportunity to learn from our brilliant speaker the great work he is doing to extend the health span of Singapore population. A quick note on the event flow. We will start with a presentation by Prof. Kennedy, followed by a fireside chat moderated by Adrienne, Director, SS Health International, then a Q&A session. Next, I'm going to hand over to Prof. Kennedy to start his presentation. Brian, please.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Let me get my screen shared here and we'll get started. I thank everyone also for tuning in. I know it's always better to do these things in person, and you know, I have sorry, hang on one sec. I really think that when Donald Trump blamed another country for starting the virus, that was totally crazy. But my theory is that Zoom started this virus, because all I do now is use Zoom. So anyway, that's my conspiracy theory, and I'm sticking to it. But today I'm going to tell you a little bit about healthy aging and can we actually extend health span. And I'm going to spend the first part of the talk trying to convince you of the importance of this strategy. Give you one example of a small molecule intervention that actually compresses morbidity, and I'll tell you what that means in animal models, and then talk about how we're moving these studies into humans in an effort to try to allow Singaporeans to have longer, healthier lives. So this is really the challenge in Singapore. The percentage of people over the age of 65 is going up quite rapidly. And by 2030, 1 in 4 people in this population is going to be over the age of 65. And if you translate that a different way, that means there are only going to be 2 people working for every retired person. And if that retired person is unhealthy or needs a caregiver, you can move another person out of this column as well in terms of driving the economy forward and doing innovation. So essentially, this means there are not enough people working to take care of all the people that are old. And it's worse than that, because we're not, you probably know that Singaporeans are living longer. It's one of the longest lived countries in the world. But we're also extending the unhealthy years with the current medical strategy we're taking. And in fact, the period of unhealthy years is going up faster than the life expectancy. So we're keeping you alive longer, but we're keeping you sick longer. And you can measure that in healthcare costs. If you look at someone over the age of 65 who doesn't have any chronic conditions, their costs are still relatively low. But if you add one chronic disease or even two or more chronic diseases, the costs skyrocket. So I think it's pretty obvious that if we can keep people healthy longer, this is a huge economic savings for Singapore. So what is it about aging that causes all these things to happen? So I'm going to give you one slide just talking about the biology of aging here. And I won't try to go too deeply into it. We wrote this review 4 or 5 years ago, and several professors got together and came up with 7 different things that we think are drivers of the aging process. Things like altered metabolism, damage to molecules in your cells, inflammation, which is a big driver, etc. But I don't want to go through the individual points. What I want to emphasize today is the connectivity between these 7 factors. Really, the way I think of aging is that healthy aging is the maintenance of a homeostatic network that keeps you functioning as you get older. So damage is happening to all of us, but our body compensates for that damage, and we maintain our ability to function at high levels and be disease-free. But when enough problems happen to these hallmarks, this network starts to break down. And when it breaks down, you spin out of equilibrium, and that's when you start getting chronic diseases. So when we're looking at healthy interventions, we're really talking about preventative strategies to maintain this functional network to keep you healthy and keep you from getting sick. And so really it's a shift, and this is the whole point of this talk really, is we're shifting from sick care to health care. The strategy of waiting till you get one of these diseases and then throwing a lot of money at trying to cure it doesn't work very well. What we end up doing is keeping people alive longer. We certainly improve some aspects of their health, but we rarely cure these diseases completely. And even if we do, older people tend to get another one of the diseases shortly after we cure the first one. What we want to do instead is to take the biggest risk factor for all of these diseases, target that as a means to prevent them all simultaneously. We think this is a more economically feasible approach, and the important thing is it keeps people healthy rather than keeping them sick. Let me give you an example of what I mean. This is the Framingham heart study, essentially if you want to know your risk of cardiovascular disease, you measure all these parameters here, figure out where you are on the chart, go over and just count up the points, and that's your risk of cardiovascular event in a 5-year window. So let's take an extremely unhealthy person. This person is 32 years old. He goes to the doctor, and they measure all these parameters, and they all come out bad. So the doctor looks at him and says, you have to completely take control of your life. You can't go on living the way you are. You have low HDL, but high cholesterol. You have high untreated blood pressure. You smoke, and you're already diabetic. If you don't do something about this, you're going to have a heart attack or a stroke in the next few years. We have to take active control of your health now. We need to get you onto some statins, onto some beta blockers, onto some metformin, and maybe get you a team of psychologists to help you stop smoking. And we have to do this now, or else we're going to regret it later. Well, there's nothing wrong with what this doctor said. This person looks relatively unhealthy, or very unhealthy for this period of their life. But let's take the next example. This is the healthiest person you've ever seen. So this guy comes into the doctor, he's 77, and he has great measurements here. I actually don't know if this person actually exists, but just take it for granted for now. This person has moderate HDL, low cholesterol, low untreated blood pressure, doesn't smoke, and not diabetic. So when the doctor comes to see him, the doctor says, you are doing great. Don't change anything. Everything's perfect. Just keep doing what you're doing. And the point I want to make is that that's not what the doctor should say. The doctor should come to this individual and say, you know, we looked at your data. We brought in an artificial intelligence data analytics team, looked at it carefully, and we've come to the conclusion that you're old. And because of the fact that you're 77, you have a very high risk of a cardiovascular event in the next few years. In fact, this person has the same risk as the other person in their 30s with all of these bad parameters. And that's because This is the dominant event in cardiovascular disease, your age. That's the biggest risk factor. It's much bigger than cholesterol or any of these other parameters. And so the question is, why don't we do something about age? And that's what I'm going to tell you today. And before I go on, I've already shown you this slide that aging is the biggest risk factor for all these chronic diseases of aging. But I think it's worth pointing out that it's also the biggest risk factor for mortality due to acute diseases. As you know, if you're older than 65, you have an 8-fold increased risk of mortality due to coronavirus than younger people. And that's true for other viruses that cause acute respiratory distress as well. And aging also causes functional decline. So the faster you're aging, the more you lose your ability to work at high levels of efficiency and enjoy life in many different ways. All right, so none of this matters if we can't do anything about aging, but there are numerous interventions now that have been developed that in animal models slow the aging process. I didn't list them all. I just chose ones that we're working on in my lab. And I'm just going to emphasize one today, alpha-ketoglutarate, for the point of using an example of showing what can be done. So I'll take you through a few slides on a preclinical model and then tell you how we're going to get into humans. So alpha-ketoglutarate is over here. It's a natural product. It's generally regarded as safe. You can buy it in the supplement store already today. And what we found is that when you give it to mice at a relatively late period of their life, so 18 months in a mouse is about 60 years old in a human, that it extends lifespan. It's significant in females. It's not quite significant in males in this cohort, but there is a moderate lifespan extension. And this has been repeated in multiple cohorts now, so this result always holds true. But I'm not showing you this because of the effects on lifespan. It does extend lifespan, but the effects are very modest. The important point here is that it dramatically reduces frailty. And so this is probably the most complicated slide I'm going to show you here, so just bear with me a little bit. So what we're doing is at different months of age, we're measuring the frailty of the animals in the study. So every dot is an animal at a different age range. The blue dots are controls and the red dots are AKG treated. And you can see that the blue dots go up faster than the red dots as the mice get older. And this is a frailty index. So we're measuring the total frailty of these animals. So while the control animals are getting increasingly frail, the AKG animals are protected from frailty. So there's a problem with plotting the data this way though, because these animals are starting to die through this period. So if you look at this dot, animal has a very high frailty, and it was dead by 25 months. And so it disappears from the frailty score. So what we've gone back and done is replotted this frailty as a percentage of the animal's lifespan. So all of these dots were taken between 50 and 60% of the animal's lifespan, 60 and 70, 70 and 80, etc. And what you can see is that the frailty in the control animals goes up steadily until all the mice are dead. And the AKG treated animals are almost completely protected from frailty. So what we see here is only a 10% extension in lifespan, but almost a 50% reduction in frailty, which is a good metric for health span. So that's what we mean by compressed morbidity, where actually these animals are healthy until a very late point in their life, and then they rapidly decline and die. They have many other parameters of health as well. First of all, just look at some pictures. So these are 27-month-old animals. These are the control animals. They are losing their hair. They're getting gray hair, although it's a little bit hard to see. Their general coat condition looks bad. There's a blister here. And these AKG treated animals are almost completely protected. Their coats look normal. And so many of these different individual parameters of health are improved in the alpha-ketoglutarate treated animals as well. And in fact, we can see better adult stem cell function, better metabolism in cells, enhanced respiration, altered microbiome function. Importantly, we see reduced inflammation, and I'll show you one slide on that. And then we've looked at a number of aging biomarkers already in humans in some cases, and we see some improvements. So if you just go back to this hair phenotype, normally when you look at these hair bulbs, they have melanocytes in them that produce coloration. for the hair that grows out. But normally in older animals, you lose these melanocytes, and that's why the hair turns gray. But in the AKG-treated animal, we keep the stem cells functioning much longer, and that keeps the coat color normal later in life. And this, we think AKG is improving the function of adult stem cells in many other tissues as well, not just in the hair follicles. And just one more slide. This is inflammation, and on this graph, what we're looking at is many different inflammatory factors at 28 months of age compared to 18 months. So as these boxes get redder, that means that these inflammatory factors are going up in levels. So these mice are experiencing more chronic inflammation. But you can see that the AKG-treated mice are largely protected. The boxes don't turn as red, so they're protected from the inflammation with age. So I don't want to spend my whole talk on alpha-ketoglutarate, but I just wanted to use that as an example. Many of these other interventions we're studying have interesting properties as well. The challenge, of course, is how do we get them into humans? And that's one of the reasons I came to Singapore to set up this Center for Healthy Longevity. So we're doing this at NUS and NUHS. And the idea is to combine preclinical research of the kind I just showed you, but to take our discoveries and translate them into the clinic, doing clinical studies to validate that we can actually alter the rate of human aging, and also to choose interventions that are economical in a way that we can move them into the community and extend health span in Singapore within a reasonable time frame. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of our strategy for this and the rest of the talk. In the preclinical side, we're already doing a number of projects. I'll just highlight one of them. This is a project at NUS to look at healthy brain aging, and we have a number of different investigators in the aging research program and also in the Department of Biology at NUS that are working together in a collaborative fashion to try to understand how the brain normally ages and what are the changes that underlie the progression of neurodegeneration, and then to develop translational paths to slow down this aging process. There are a number of other projects like this that are moving forward as well. On the clinical side, we have many different projects moving, but I think the flagship project is to work on how do we extend health span. And so we're not working with people who are already frail. What we're trying to do is to prevent the onset of these chronic diseases. Let me modify that a bit. We are doing other studies in people that have frailty or cachexia, but this flagship study is in people that are 45 to 65 and they're at risk of chronic disease. So let me tell you a little bit about how we're planning and starting these studies. Now you can imagine doing a long-term study or a medium-term study, and this is happening in the US with a drug called metformin. You take people in their 60s, you put them on a drug for 1 to 3 years, and you try to show that you can prevent the onset of many different chronic diseases simultaneously. The problem with this kind of study is it costs about $60 million at 14 centers. And it's really hard to get things like that funded when you're talking about a drug like metformin, which is off patent and costs something like 4 cents a day. So instead, and I think the problem with this approach is that I'm not sure that metformin is the best longevity intervention. I prefer other interventions, but none of us really know which ones are going to work best. And so what we need is a strategy to test multiple different kinds of interventions simultaneously. And so we've turned to a different approach, which are shorter term studies up to 6 months. And instead of looking at disease prevention, which takes huge cohorts, we're looking at biomarkers of aging, which are recently been developed and allow us to determine the rate at which you're aging biologically. So your passport is really good at measuring your chronologic age, but we all know that people age at different rates. And we now have biomarkers that we can put together to begin to assess how an individual is aging at the biologic level. Let me take you through aging biomarkers just briefly. This is a review I did with a company called Syntara. So if this is the age, there have been a number of different kinds of biomarkers over the years. The most successful ones have been related to physical ability. So these are things like walking speed, time to get up and go, grip strength, and they're actually fairly effective at predicting aging in the older population, but not so good in people under the age of 60, which is where we want to do our interventions. There are also molecular and cellular biomarkers and systemic markers like hormones, but none of these individually turned out to be that good at measuring biologic aging. What's happened, though, over the last 5 to 10 years is that a number of investigators have used artificial intelligence and omics strategies to develop AI-driven predictors of biologic age. And some of these biologic age markers are working quite well. Let me move to the next slide. So the first generation of these biologic age markers were using a single data set like methylation of the DNA or microbiome or transcriptomics or even facial pattern recognition. And they also used the chronologic age of the individual, and they let a computer optimize to chronologic age. The divergence from the computer prediction and the chronologic age is proposed to be the biologic age. So if I'm 53 and this predictor says that I'm 60, that means I'm aging more rapidly than I should be. And if I'm 45, vice versa. These turn out to be quite good, but by only measuring one parameter, you're a little bit limited in what you're assessing. And also these different the biomarkers that have been developed have not been compared to each other very well. There's now a second generation that's been proposed in the last year, which is to combine these single data set markers with some of the original clinical biomarkers that were proposed to measure age. And that does a better job of predicting mortality. So this is a step in the right direction. And we think we need to move to yet a third generation where we're combining these biologic aging markers with organ-specific measures of aging, so we can not only predict when this network is going to break down, but what kinds of diseases people are going to get when they start to age more rapidly. So a lot of what we're doing with Jasmine and SGInnovate is to try to develop biomarkers that are specific for the Singapore population. Very little of these studies have been done in Asia and not in Singapore. And so we want to develop a diagnostic strategy to accurately predict biologic age of people. What we're doing as soon as the coronavirus epidemic calms down a bit is bringing people in and doing first cross-sectional studies of the population, looking at some of the original physiologic biomarkers, some of the new AI-driven biomarkers, and some other assessments to put this together in a way that will measure the biologic aging signature of an individual. There's really 2 points of value to this. One is that we can stratify the population by risk. So we're looking at aging, which is the biggest risk factor for almost everything. And if we can find people that are biologically older than they should be, those are the people that should be picked out for lifestyle interventions and potentially small molecule interventions designed to reverse aspects of biologic aging. And so the stratification component of this alone is critical. If we can find the people that are at the highest risk, then we can do interventions in a much more successful way. But the other thing we want to use these for is, at least initially, is endpoints to show that our interventions are working. And so we want to take interventions like alpha KETO-GLUTARATE, which is a very safe molecule, give it to people and see if we can reverse these biologic aging signatures. Now, I'll just point out the interest in this in the rest of the world is getting to be very large. There's a lot of investment now in the private sector. And also in the academic side, I'm editor-in-chief of a journal, Aging Cell. We got a paper we published last year, which was really not a very good data-driven paper. There were only 9 individuals that did a combination of 3 interventions, self-dosing for 1 year, and then measured their methylation age. They were able to show that 1 year of intervention would reverse the methylation age by 2.5 years. We almost didn't publish this because there was no controls, but we thought it was provocative and it should be out in the community, so we published it. I recently looked at this. We're 5 months after publication, and we have something like 87,000 downloads of that paper. This is an academic journal that the public doesn't generally go to, but it just shows you the interest in slowing the aging process. And it also is at least a first indicator that it may be possible to reverse aspects of biologic aging. So we're doing this cross-sectional study. We're also starting 2 other studies at Alexandria, where the clinical component of our center is going to be. One is to look at exercise intervention and how that affects these biomarker profiles. And the second is to use alpha-ketoglutarate in a clinical trial to see if we can reverse biologic aging. I'll just go through this quickly. We have all kinds of other clinical studies going on that we're supporting, some of which are being led by other groups in Singapore. We have longitudinal studies looking at exceptionally healthy people in the population. We're doing SG90, but we're supporting these other studies as well. As I mentioned, we're also applying these biomarkers to these later age individuals to see if in the people over the age of 85, we can, the biologic age markers effectively highlight the people that were able to avoid getting chronic diseases. And we're supporting a number of intervention studies of all kinds of different kinds, including things like choral singing and Singer, which is a adaptation, this is by Chris Chin at NUS, an adaptation of the finger trial in Finland, where it's a set of lifestyle interventions to see if we can slow the rate of vascular dementia in the population. We have a number of collaborators as well, and there's we think there's many different outputs for measuring biologic aging. For instance, we're working with the Singapore Perioperative aging study to try to see if aging biomarkers can predict who's going to have better outcomes in people facing major elective surgeries moving forward. We're working on reproductive aging to see if we can slow down the reproductive aging process so women can have more control over when they want to have babies as they get older, etc. So there's a lot of different outputs of these kinds of studies. We've been talking to and setting up collaborations with a number of government agencies. All of these different groups work on exercise-driven interventions that may affect healthy aging. The Health Promotion Board works largely on wearables and health tracking. Sport SG is more directed toward getting people to exercise aerobically and with resistance training. And then private enterprise like Bespoke Fitness is really taking a much more vigorous approach to high intensity exercise. So the question here is, as we ramp up the level of exercise moving across these 3 types of programs, where do we have the biggest impact on biologic age? Do you need to be doing extensive training to have a big impact, or will an extra few thousand steps a day be sufficient? I suspect we'll get a graded response, but this really hasn't been tested in the context of aging biomarkers. We're also very interested in bringing in corporate partners and helping to make Singapore a center of aging biotechnology as we're going forward. There are now probably 50 or more companies that are working in the aging biotechnology space, but Asia has really not adopted this yet, and we're hoped to be a triggering point to bring a number of companies in. These are some companies we're already collaborating with in various ways, and there are a number of others that are in discussion now. So I just want to end with one point, and this came from a book I just read, but it struck a chord in terms of how we think about aging. So in this case, the book is not about aging. It's about behavioral problems that people have, like anxiety and depression. And the potential value of using psychedelics like LSD and other drugs of that kind. I don't know if you know much of the history of this, but there was a lot of research on the potential value of psychedelics in the 50s and 60s. But then when the counterculture craze adopted LSD, it scared a lot of people, and then that made all of these drugs illegal. But when they're given to people with sufficient oversight, they're very safe drugs that are not particularly addictive. And so now the research has started up again to see if LSD can help with everything from alcoholism to depression to anxiety to acceptance of mortality for people that are facing death from some disease in the near future. And the mainstream culture has finally adopted this concept that these psychedelics might work. But when you read this book, the doctors that are at the center of behavioral medicine are saying, You should only use this to treat the sick. Do not use this for the betterment of the well. Never give these drugs to people that are well. They're not saying this necessarily because they're afraid you're going to cause problems for well people. They're saying it because they're afraid that the culture won't accept the idea that we're trying to give things to well people. And this is the same concept with aging. We're doing, with medicine in general, in fact, we're doing sick care, and we're afraid to do health care. But we really should be concerned about the betterment of the well. And many of these aging interventions actually improve function now and don't just protect against disease later. If you're exercising, if you're eating healthy, and maybe if you're taking some of these small molecules, you'll have better ability to function now in your 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, not just wait until your 60s and say, I don't have some disease I would otherwise have had. So I think we need to change this medical paradigm, and we should be helping people over the life course to try to maximize their health and their happiness throughout their life, rather than waiting till they get some chronic disease that's extremely hard to treat and then spending a lot of money relatively unsuccessfully. And so I think this concept and the aging concept I talked about today have that in common, and there are probably many other strategies too that we should be really moving medicine away from sick care, or and again, I don't mean completely away from sick care. Obviously, if I get sick, I want to be treated, but to rebalance medicine so that we're not just doing sick care, but we're putting much more effort into how we do health care. So with that, I'll stop. I have many collaborators and people that have helped out on these projects. And the people that are highlighted in light blue here have helped work on the alpha-ketoglutarate project. And thank you for your time. I'm happy to take questions.
Brian, thank you for that presentation. There's a lot of information, and what's great is that we're already starting to get a lot of questions. So a reminder to everyone, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and then also please vote for questions that you would like to see asked as well. It's great that we're already getting a lot of questions in. And I see that someone just asked if we're going to be able to share the slides. I think SGInnovate will be able to answer this, but they are recording this session as well. So a few questions that I have for you, Brian. One is, and we had a conversation about this, and you mentioned this in one of your slides, about how you really bring this research into the community. So with this biomedical approach, how do you combine you know, this work on biomarkers with social determinants of health, which we know have a very large impact on the process and the rate of aging as well, and really make this a community-driven approach as well?
Yeah, I think that's a major challenge, and it's one that hasn't been solved yet. And one of the key things we have to do is bring together the preclinical and translational researchers like myself with the geriatricians who are in the community, and they're largely in the past have been focused on managing the aging process. So that's helping people maintain some quality of life when they have multiple chronic conditions later in their own life. And what we're really trying to do is prevention. And so we need to get together as a group and figure out how we can move back interventions so that we're trying to keep people healthy, and how do we move that into the community. One of the reasons we're at Alexandra Hospital is that this is going to be more of a community-driven hospital. And the other thing is we're choosing, at least initially, interventions that are either drugs that are off patent or natural products that are relatively cheap. And so if we can validate that they slow or reverse components of aging, it will be economically feasible for the government to test this in a wider community. I think that I didn't mention this, and I meant to, but if we can extend HEALTHSPAN by as much as 5 years in Singapore, the savings to the government is, in the healthcare cost is $550 million over the short term. So there is a huge increase in healthcare costs that's happening in all countries. And what we have to do is figure out a way to keep to slow down this aging process and keep people healthy and functional longer. It's also important because retirement age is going up, and so we need to keep people functional so that they can work effectively at later ages. Otherwise, that strategy is not going to be effective. So I don't think we've solved this problem yet, but I think you've highlighted what's probably the biggest challenge. How do we take all of these exciting interventions, move them into human studies, validate them, and then get them into the community?
Well, I think that might be one of the top challenges as well is, we had also discussed this earlier, is that a lot of the research around aging is happening in higher income countries. Yet we know that lower and middle income countries, while aging is maybe not the top health priority or the issue that gets the most visibility, people are increasingly looking at aging and healthy longevity. And so how do you middle income countries, but also partnering and working with lower and middle income countries on their national healthcare strategies, especially when they're projecting out 5, 10, 15 years from now, and what they will need to make, where they will need to make those investments now for their healthcare needs in 10, 15 years.
Yeah, let me try to answer that. You cut in and out a little bit, so I'm going to answer the question. I'll answer the question I think you asked. So,
okay. Sorry about that.
No. So, look, I think that you're right. Most of the focus on aging has been in developed countries where there's really long lifespan and low birth rate. But several years ago, I was going to give a TEDx talk in Madagascar on aging. And on the plane, I was thinking, why am I going to Madagascar to talk about aging? The life expectancy is in the 50s. But when you look up the causes of mortality in developing countries, usually around 4 or 5 of the top 10 causes are actually age-related diseases. And what's happening is they're occurring much earlier in people's lives than happening in developed countries. So people are getting cardiovascular disease in their 40s and 50s instead of their 60s and 70s. So there's a lot of interesting research questions there. What is it about lifestyle and environment that seems to be accelerating aging? And as these countries solve some of their non-age-related issues like food security and water quality and treatment of infectious disease, they're rapidly getting a challenge with the aging population, much more rapidly than happened in developed countries. So this is going to be a major concern globally. We're going to have 9 billion people on Earth in 2050, and 2 billion of them are going to be over the age of 60. So it's not just developed countries. And I think moving more locally, what I'd like to see is that Singapore becomes a hub of this new type of research. Aging is arguably the biggest medical challenge that we're going to face in this century, and we need to tackle it head on. And this really hasn't been done in an effective way in Asia yet. And I think Singapore can be a leader in that, and then work with neighboring countries in the ASEAN region to help them develop strategies for healthy aging. And already some of these countries are thinking about this and have made some progress, but it really needs to be a global strategy for how we deal with such an increasing number of the older population.
And you brought up a really good point, is that we really need to make these investments in innovations around aging, because this will be the biggest healthcare issue and even economic issue of the next century. And there was someone who we had worked with at Economic Development Board at one point who really wanted to look at, could aging be the next water story of Singapore? How do you really capitalize on the fact that you have all of this investments into happening, and you also have not only the regional location, but in Singapore, this quickly aging population. So what are those investments and opportunities, both from the corporate side and also startups? And, I've had a number of conversations with people at MCs over the years. A notion rather than a strategic investment into products and services around aging. And so what do you see as, how do we push this innovation forward? And both, again, with startups, but then also with corporations as well, and really create this innovation ecosystem around aging?
Yeah, I think it has to be a concerted strategy. You know, Singapore's Singapore, I'm very impressed with the way the government works here. It's very progressive thinking. They identify problems that are going to be there in the near future and try to develop strategies to deal with them. And they've identified aging as a major issue. I think that there's been a bit more challenge about how do you tackle that problem. And to me, it has to be a concerted strategy that supports academic development, but also supports academic private partnerships and brings in companies to really create a hub for research in Singapore. You know, one of the challenges that I've found is that it's really difficult to get startup companies here because that initial investment is a big challenge. And so if a company's already developing, you can get larger scale investment at later levels. But the A round, the angel round, getting VCs interested in companies that may take time to develop rather than come to the market in the next 1 to 2 years. That kind of approach has not really taken hold yet in Southeast Asia. And so I think that what needs to happen is we need to catalyze startup companies and early stage companies to come to Singapore and then support partnerships with the academic sector so that we can really develop strategies. And I don't mean just strategies like I'm talking about to keep people healthy, but devices, technology, and a whole range of different components that can help the aging population. I think there's a huge opportunity to do that. It really hasn't been embraced in Asia yet, although it's happening in California and parts of Europe. And so the opportunity is there, but it has to be a concerted, committed effort. Little bits of money here and there, I think, is unlikely to solve the problem.
So I'm going to turn it over to the audience Q&A because we have 24 questions already coming in. And I have to say, you know, SGInnovate does such an incredible job of bringing together a really diverse audience. So looking at the viewers here, seeing a number of names that I recognize from the academic world and also foundations, startups, corporates, and others in the university system as well. So very, I think it's an important message and you have the right audience for this. And everyone, a reminder to please vote so you can make my job easier with 24 questions to be able to prioritize this as well. So one is Ethan asks, what is the effect of AKG in obese and inactive mice? The suspicion is that the anti-aging effect of AKG may be attenuated in the presence of other metabolic factors, and that may be the problem in clinical settings where humans tend to be less amenable to behavioral interventions.
Yeah, well, let me take a broad answer to that question. First is that we're not trying to develop interventions that replace healthy lifestyles. And so I think that I didn't spend much time on this today, but I would always encourage healthy lifestyle behavior because we already know that works to slow aging. Exercise, healthy diet, stress management, sleep, etc. Many of these mice are actually obese when they get older. This is a common feature of mouse aging as well as human aging, partly because they're probably eating too much food. So the type of diet they have is not particularly healthy. In fact, you know, the normal diet we call a Western diet because it's the balance of macronutrients is not particularly great for these mice. This is just standardly how it's been done. And AKG is quite effective there. The answer is we're very confident that AKG is going to be a safe intervention. It's been given up to 3 grams a day in clinical studies already with no side effects. But we're just starting the intervention studies. A company has funded this research, and so they're doing a clinical trial in the US looking at the product, which contains AKG and another component as well. And we're going to look specifically here at AKG without the other components because we want to understand what's going on mechanistically. My hope is that this is going to have broad benefits to the population, and we have some human data already, although it's anecdotal, to suggest that it might. But I don't think any single intervention is going to help every person. And so one of the reasons we have to personalize these biomarkers is we have to be able ultimately to understand how a person is aging individually, not just in a big group, because that may help us select which interventions are most likely to work. There's been this question comes up with metformin a lot too, that, you know, metformin's typically given to people who have hyperglycemia and are diabetic, and it may slow aging in that population, but will it do anything in a normal population? And we don't know the answer to that either. That's why we have to do these human clinical studies to really begin to tease out the answers to these questions.
So we have a few questions related to really how we measure age. So with one person asking, are we putting too much emphasis on the correlation between the age and disease? And someone else asking, you know, what really is that definition of quality aging? And I'm going to combine one more question into this, is then as we have that definition of quality aging, how do we, is it possible to identify really the lifestyle and environmental factors that are the biggest contributors to aging? And how has that changed over time?
Yeah, I think people have sort of argued about the definition of aging for a long time. To use the G-rated version of the definition, so if you bring a lot of scientists in a room and have them argue, they come up with the following definition, that bad things happen and then you die. And so, which is not very helpful. And so I think that, as I said, the way I think about healthy aging is maintaining that homeostatic network that keeps you functioning. And it's not just about preventing disease, it's about functionality as you get older as well. You know, how much stamina you have, how much energy you have, whether you can still do athletic things, whether you have endurance, whether your thinking is still cogent and fast. And so I think that, you know, I don't want to say that we're just trying to prevent disease here. I think that it's important that these interventions are likely to affect your function as well. You know, in terms of what interventions and what lifestyle modifications, we already pretty much know exercise works. If you look at things like the Stanford Runners study, it's extending lifespan, and it's reducing the risk of a whole range of diseases, not just diabetes and cardiovascular disease, but Alzheimer's disease and many other things. So it fits the description for an anti-aging intervention. In terms of diet, we could go into that discussion for a long time. I think the one point I would make is that the average, let's say, American male eats 3,900 calories a day when they should be eating 2,200 calories a day. That's almost certainly accelerating aspects of aging. And so bringing the level of calorie intake down to something normal and then getting a healthy balance of macronutrients is probably good for you. And I also think it's hard to measure this in animals, that stress management is critical. I think that there's a lot of evidence that people that are under chronic stress tend to have accelerated aspects of aging. So those are three things I would point to in terms of lifestyle modification.
And, you know, related to that, well, one, if it's any indicator right now of the path outside my house is during circuit breaker, a lot more people are taking up running. So maybe this will affect longevity a bit more as well. You know, one person asked, is these biomarkers, we're applying it to individuals, but how can you use these markers to globally assess more population health as a whole? And how could they be used to help governments direct their efforts for maximal improvement of health for all, rather than more of these individual or micro improvements based on diseases or constituencies?
Yeah, I think that collectively, by looking at the biomarkers, you could get an idea of the health distribution of a population. The challenge is that these newer biomarkers haven't really been applied equally to all ethnicities. And so one of the things we have to do is to look at the key ethnic populations here in Singapore and see how these biomarkers predict their age. There might be some significant differences. We know something about the Chinese population already from studies in China. But the Malay and Indian population, we don't know a whole lot about with respect to aging. So we need to begin to understand these ethnic differences that may exist. There are also lifestyle differences that might exist in Singapore that might affect this. But in general, you can look at a population and get an idea of how the population is aging and what the distribution is and how it relates to chronologic age. I think one of the main goals, as I said, though, is to be able to stratify people So we're hoping that with these biomarkers, we can find people that are at high risk of disease much earlier in life. And then even with lifestyle interventions and prevention and things like HPB is doing, you can focus your efforts on people that are likely to come down with some disease in the very near future and try to see if it can be more effective. I mean, the challenge with lifestyle intervention has always been that it's very hard to get the people to adopt that. So people that, if you look at corporate wellness programs, I've worked with some of those, and what happens is they have this 100-page document on how to be healthy, and then they find that only 15 to 20% of the people that work for them adopt these plans, and even worse, those were the people that were already doing healthy things in the first place. So I think with lifestyle intervention, the challenge is not so much telling people the right thing to do, it's getting people to sustainably adopt changes to their life that make them healthier. And if you can focus that more on people that are in greatest need, I think that'll be valuable, even in the absence of these drugs and small molecule interventions that we're developing.
But then how would you, so if you were looking at, your budget available as a policymaker, would you spend your money on identifying people who are most at risk and then having a specific intervention for them, or doing things like upgrading your city infrastructure so it's easier for everyone to exercise? Like, how does that fit into the overall health for all strategy? Because it's still very individual focused and potentially expensive.
I think that, first of all, we're trying to bring these costs down to something that's reasonable for the population. And if you look at the savings you get by extending health span, it's actually cheap to invest in aging. But having said that, I think you need a comprehensive strategy, and certainly urban planning strategies to get people outside more. The trail system here, I'm a runner, and so the trail system here is great. But the climate is a challenge, to get people outside. I think that you can't just say that we're going to devote effort to put roofs over sidewalks because more people can stay out of the sun and get out and walk. I think it has to be a strategy that's much more comprehensive than that involves the biology. And like I said, when you think about it, there's really plenty of money to invest here, because the savings you're going to get in terms of reducing healthcare costs, not to mention creating a biotech sector here, are going to be vast. And so that's why I'm saying it can't be a tiny effort to do something about the biggest medical challenge of this century. It has to be a comprehensive and well thought out effort. And it's not just done by the medicine. It has to combine things like urban planning, societal structure, try to get behavioral modification in the population. All of these things are important. And I think when you look at the savings involved, there's resources to intelligently do several of these strategies and integrate them together.
And what do you see as the biggest role for IoT, so using trackers from the phones, different wearables, and also AI as well in really guiding the future of this work? And where do you see the biggest potential there?
I think trackers are great because they give the individuals feedback. It's not, you can collect the data and look at a population, but it also gives individuals feedback on what they're doing. And I wear a tracker, especially when I'm running, and I find it very motivating to see that I'm improving my times or distance, etc. But we're also working with a company, Gero, that can actually predict biologic age from accelerometry data on trackers. So they've used an AI-based strategy to do that. And so that's interesting too, because people that are trying different interventions, you can get feedback from a large population of people if they just wear trackers and allow that data to come back to an aggregated source. So I think that's certainly one component of improving healthy lifespan, is to give people immediate feedback on their activity. But we can't use activity alone as a measure of aging. There's a number of other parameters as well, and I think that the trackers are just one component of that.
So we have a few more questions about AKG. So one is, do you look at combinations of the compounds? So for instance, AKG with D3 to see if it is more effective, or has it led to less effective outcomes? And also, what are some of the side effects around AKG?
Yeah, the company is interested in combinations of natural products because you can get intellectual property around combinations and formulations of natural products, but not individual natural products. So there's a company interest in doing that. So we've been trying to find things that work together synergistically. If you look at vitamin D, which is so the product that's in the company released for women is AKG plus vitamin D3. And the reason we chose that is because in the female mice, you see a synergistic effect on frailty. The vitamin D3 doesn't increase the lifespan that much more, but what it does is reduce the frailty even further in these animals. And in the males, we saw a bigger effect with vitamin A and AKG. We're continuing now in Singapore to test different combinations to try to improve that product even further. And so we have a lot of things that are in mice right now. And as I said, there are human clinical studies ongoing in the US already with the combinations. AKG is not reported to have side effects, really. This is a central component of the metabolism. Your cells have a lot of it, but with age, it's reported to decline. And so what we think we're doing is restoring the levels of this molecule. And as I said, it's been given, I think, for 6 months at 3 grams a day in postmenopausal women to look at osteoporosis with no reported side effects. So you can never say that any molecule has no side effects at all. They could, but there haven't been any detected by a range of clinical studies performed by many different investigators, at least to this point.
Okay. And then how do, so there's a question as well as this focus on supplements when there is also a long ways to go as far as lifestyle choice as well. How do we also weigh these interventions?
Well, as I said, I always want to encourage lifestyle modification, but the truth is people don't want to do it. Maybe it takes a coronavirus to get people out running, but I don't think we want. I don't think that trade-off is worth it. So I think we have to have a balanced approach, which is get as many people as possible to have more active lifestyles, and at the same time develop small molecules, supplements, and drugs that can help them stay healthy longer. I think you can look at this in the same context with obesity. You can now get drugs approved to treat obesity when most of these people could reduce their obesity by being more active. I don't think it's my job as a scientist to judge people's lifestyle. I think what we're trying to do is to encourage people to have healthy lifestyles and also adopt strategies to augment that so that we can extend the healthy years of life as much as possible. And I think ultimately some combination of lifestyle and small molecules, or even other strategies like regenerative medicine that we're involved with but are much further from the marketplace, are ultimately going to be the way to do this.
And so we still have quite a few questions here. I know we are up on the hour here. It's 11:02. One question on the savings that we expect to see from delaying the aging process. Do you expect that by slowing the aging process that we will see real overall savings? It really is part of that economic growth and that increased productivity, or is it a deferral of that spend?
Yes. I think it's both. I think you'll find that people are more productive later in life. They're also, I hope they'll be, if they're healthier, they're likely to be happier and more contented as well. But you're also going to see a big savings in terms of keeping people healthy longer. So even if, sorry, somebody is like hammering on something right now, so hopefully that's not coming through to everybody else. It's like inside my head. What I was going to say is that I think that even if you just extend health span and have the same period of decline, you save money. Particularly now, given that there's such a large population of people over the age of 65, if we can defer the cost of that by 5 years or more, we can save money that way. But if we can do something like what AKG does in mice, which is to compress morbidity, then we really save money, because it's that period of morbidity that's a high cost. Almost half the cost of healthcare is in the last year of a person's life. But if you have 10 or 15 years of period where people are sick, and you can compress that to 3 to 5 years, then you really start to look at not just improved quality of life, but healthcare savings.
Now, I have to ask this question. Thank you, Benjamin, for asking this question of how do we balance the issue on psychedelics versus ethics? And I have to say, you know, saying that we should consider psychedelics as a well-being approach is only my second most surreal webinar moment so far in the last 2 months in Singapore. So there was one other moment that caught my breath more than this one, but the, you know, how do you balance it? No. It was not, but I won't even say. But the so the how do you balance you know, how you look at psychedelics versus the ethics around it?
Let me just back off a little bit and say that I was using that as an example.
Yes.
I'm not proposing that psychedelics should be used for healthy aging, and I'm not an expert on mental disorders, and so I'm not the one that should be making the decision of whether we should use psychedelics in that context or not. My point, though, was that every time we develop a new intervention, like aging interventions that are designed to keep people well or improve wellness, everyone says, oh, no, we can't do that. The FDA doesn't approve treating healthy people. But I think this is just conceptually wrong, is that we should be looking at helping people with their health throughout their lifespan and not waiting till they get sick. When we wait till they get sick, it costs a lot of money and we're not that effective at treating them. If we do prevention effectively, I think we'll be much more effective. And I'll leave the question of whether to well people should be taking psychedelics to the experts, because but it's just I think there are many examples like this where everyone is afraid, based on the history, to do anything for well people, and I think that that's unfortunate. There's lots of people that don't yet have chronic diseases, or they haven't been diagnosed, but they're already suffering. There are people that are depressed. There are people that have all kinds of mental disorders that are not getting diagnosed. And if we had a more life course approach, we would find that I think we'd be much more effective in treating the health of the population.
So I think that leads well into what will probably be the last question that I ask today is, you know, speaking more to the biomarkers and dementia, which is, of course, on the rise in Singapore and most countries in the world. Where do you see is the connection between healthy aging and brain functionality, and how early we start to look at interventions in healthy aging? And I have to say I have a bias of not necessarily thinking of interventions in healthy aging, but promoting healthy aging and healthy longevity across the lifespan. So in this question, someone's asking, should we start from 30 years old? I think there's, you know, a lot of evidence saying we should start from the womb. You know, if we're really taking that lifespan approach, you know, I think Singapore is really good at this, of promoting healthy eating and healthy lifestyle starting in the preschool years. It's part of the education here, and they have the preschools working closely with Health Promotion Board. But yeah, what do you see as the connection with healthy aging and brain functionality, especially given your work with biomarkers? And really, where do you see, you know, where do we start on that lifespan approach with healthy aging?
Yeah, let me start with the second half of that question and say that you basically already answered it. I think when we're talking about
I think I did. Sorry about that. But
I think when we're talking about healthy lifestyle, and we should be doing it from the womb. And if you look at some of the studies that have been done in Singapore, like the GUSTO study at Singapore Institute of Clinical Sciences and NUS, which looks at health of the mothers, pregnancy, and how that affects the behavior and the health of the children. I think these are very exciting studies, and we really should be looking across the entire life course in terms of behavior and lifestyle intervention. I think for the small molecules and drugs, we want to start in people that are at risk of getting disease in the next few years. Ultimately, we might want to move those interventions earlier in life as well. But right now, we're trying to pick the most sensitive point where we can have the biggest effect and validate that these things are slowing aging. So that's a starting point. coming back to your earlier, oh, it's about brain aging, yeah. So I think that, you know, part of the reason we're seeing a huge increase in Alzheimer's disease is that there are more older people, which just reinforces the notion that aging is a big risk factor for this disease, and also because we have been effective at treating some chronic diseases, so people are living longer and getting more Alzheimer's. Again, I think that the way I think of it is that there are intrinsic aging processes, and when they go wrong, that increases the risk of a whole range of different chronic diseases. And then there are disease-specific processes, like maybe ApoE4 for Alzheimer's disease, that define which diseases you get as you get older. So we really need to understand how the systemic markers of aging interface with the disease-specific markers of aging to be able to predict which diseases people are going to get, and that'll also inform about interventions that have the biggest effect in an individual. But it's certainly clear that if you do interventions that slow aging, like exercise, you dramatically decrease the risk of things like Alzheimer's disease as well. So I think this preventative approach is going to work almost across the spectrum of chronic diseases. Whereas once you get a specific disease, then you have to treat it specifically. And so far with neurodegenerative diseases, that hasn't been very successful. So what I'm arguing for is to really bring in this component of aging, which is, again, is the biggest risk factor, and integrate that with all the other knowledge we have about specific disease, including Alzheimer's.
So I was wrong. I'm going to ask one more question. And my background is health promotion, so I'm absolutely on the side of prevention, health promotion, and really helping improve people's quality of life across the spectrum, which results in healthier, being physically and mentally healthy. You know, Dr. Tucker is asking, how can you measure chronic stress in healthy adults? And why I think this question is pretty important is across the lifespan, different populations, we see a lot of academic research on, you know, interventions for the most stressed, the people who are really, you know, who we put into the category of a vulnerable person, a vulnerable population, but not looking at the spectrum of chronic stress and how that is going to affect someone's health outcomes as well. So how do you measure chronic stress in people who we would otherwise consider non-healthy or not at risk?
Yeah, I think this has been a challenge, and again, we're venturing outside my area of expertise. But you know, I bring up stress because to me, it's more of an intuitive feel that I have that this is driving aspects of aging. It's a much harder thing to measure than metabolic parameters of other diseases or things that you can test in animal models and in humans. So I agree. I think that we tend to pick people that are really having loss of functionality because the stress is so high, and we're probably missing a much larger portion of the community that has, you know, dealing with chronic levels of stress, but it's not getting diagnosed or identified. And we certainly need better ways to help to identify those people in the population as well. I think that this is a challenge in that field for sure.
So, you know, thank you again for sharing your insights with us, both the research that you're doing in the lab. I think, you know, lab scientists everywhere are excited to get back to the bench.
Yes, definitely.
And so thank you for sharing this time with us today. And hopefully we have the opportunity to work together more in the future as well. And we had that discussion about, you know, what really can we do to push more around innovations in aging, and not just for Singapore, but looking at what those needs are in the region. And I think what's great is with this audience right here as well, it's a great way to start that conversation again. As you know, Access Health has done this work with modern aging and NUS Enterprise in the past, and working with SGInnovate on this as well. So this is more of my open invitation of if there are others who would like to continue to work in the areas of innovations in aging and really bridging that public and private sector investments into this area, you know, we would love to have that conversation as well.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm happy to help in any way I can too.
Great, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you, Professor Kennedy and Adrienne, for such an engaging fireside chat, and Professor Kennedy for the engaging presentation. If I could just ask you guys to just do a little wave so I could take a little photo of today. Yes, yep. Okay, hold on. 1, 2, 3, cheese. Oh, sorry, not yet. Yep. 1, 2, 3,
Okay.
cheese. One more. Yep. Thank you so much. I'll be sending it over. Yeah, I'd like to also thank our attendees for attending the session, as all the great questions that Adrienne managed to ask Professor Kennedy as well. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you.